Welcome back to our conversation about the Understanding by Design framework used for unit development. This is the second part of our three-part focus on Understanding by Design, which is part of our larger series of screencasts focused on teaching and learning in the Falmouth Public Schools. I'm Sonia Tellier, Director of Curriculum and Instruction for Secondary Education, and I'm joined by
I'm Zach Wadaker, the Director of Curriculum and Instruction for Elementary Education in Falmouth Public Schools, and we're happy that you're joining us today in part of our series on teaching and learning within the school district.
So as we return to our conversation about UbD, or Understanding by Design, here you have in front of you on the screen a look at our agenda for this part of the conversation. We're again going to root our conversation in the Falmouth Public Schools strategic plan. We're going to talk about an overarching view of the UbD framework as a whole, and then we're going to call out Stage 2 evidence, much like we did in the first part about Stage 1 desired results. Within this part of the conversation, we're going to look at evaluation criteria and assessment evidence, and for each of these subparts, we're going to look at what they look like on the framework themselves, on the template. We're going to talk about some guiding questions that as you answer those questions, you can help to flesh out your ideas and populate that part of the unit plan. And then we're going to talk about some common pitfalls or obstacles you may encounter along the way and hopefully give you some ideas or strategies on how to avoid them or at least make your way through them.
We'll also be looking at an example of a Stage 2 template that is filled out. This example is going to reflect back on the example that we used back in our Stage 1 screencast, talking about our driver's education scenario.
And then finally, we're going to conclude by talking about resources that we have available to our colleagues across the district here in the Office of Curriculum and Instruction.
For those of you who are watching this screencast, it's important to remember that this is just an introductory look at the UbD framework for unit development, and certainly just an introductory look at Stage 2. If you're watching this and you have some questions as you go along the way, just write them down and feel free to contact our office, and we'll be happy to help you along this process.
So here we have our look at the Falmouth Public Schools strategic plan. Within this circle, you can see the arrows connecting each of our three larger objectives: teaching and learning, access and equity, and community engagement. And all three of these are interconnected, and they all contribute to the success of our students, the success of our faculty and staff, and the success of our schools as a whole within the district. However, in this part of the conversation, we're going to call out Initiative Statement 1, Understanding by Design, taken from the Teaching and Learning Objective. In particular, we're going to look at building the internal capacity to fully implement UbD as a system for developing curricular activities, including instruction and assessment for all students across all grade levels within our schools.
So what does that really mean? That means that we're trying to give our teachers and our faculty and our staff and our administrators the tools that they need to really develop high levels units of study that have high levels of student engagement, that are rigorous, and that provide opportunities for students to demonstrate their learning in a variety of ways. And we in the district feel like the Understanding by Design framework helps us do just that. And by having these screencasts and certainly some of the professional development programs that Sonia and I participate in, we really feel like we're helping build that capacity frequently.
And I think one of the conversations that Zach and I have repeatedly and that we share with our colleagues is that high quality instruction will naturally lead to high impact on assessments. And part of what I mean by that is talking about MCAS scores, or perhaps later talking about PARCC scores. We should naturally see high levels of achievement and growth as a result of the high quality instruction and the high quality teaching and learning that goes on in our classrooms. So here you have, leading into that conversation, a global look at the UbD framework. How do we get at that high quality instruction, that high quality teaching and learning? So in the first part, we talked about Stage 1 or desired results, and you can see the four facets that we called out in that conversation. We're now going to focus on Stage 2 or evidence, and you can see the two facets we're going to call out here. And then in the third and final part on this focus, we're going to talk about Stage 3 in the following screencast, looking at the learning plan.
So when we looked at our previous screencast on Stage 1 desired results, we were looking at local, state, and federal learning objectives, which really help teachers and curriculum developers identify what the end goal is. What do we hope students will attain as a result of our instruction? So today when we talk about stage 2 evidence, now that we know what our end goal is, what are we going to do at the end of our unit of study to ensure that students have met these goals? And that's what evidence, the stage 2 portion of UbD framework, is all about.
And we're going to make many connections back to stage 1, especially talking about knowledge, skills, and transfer. What do you do with the understandings that you arrive at, and how are they transferred out to other settings? So here we begin with a look at stage 2. This is what it looks like when we separate it out from the overall framework and we look at the different components.
So the overall understanding by design template would have all 3 stages on 1 or maybe 2 pages. For the sake of the discussion today, we just wanted to pull out stage 2 evidence. You can see that this template is divided into 2 columns, the first being evaluation criteria and the second being assessment evidence. And let's start with the evaluation criteria.
So it's important at this point that we kind of give you a frame to help aid your understanding. So when we talk about evaluation criteria, I think the easiest thing for us to do is liken it to the development of a rubric. When you're talking about the evaluation criteria, you're talking about the criteria or the qualities by which you're going to measure a student's performance, really how you're going to assess their learning based on the task or performance that they've just completed.
You're going to want to look at the qualities that the students possess, or the information or the content that the work reflects. This will show you, again, what the students understand and what they're able to do. And this could take a variety of different, could look different depending on the different units of study, the different content area that you teach, and the different grade levels in which we work.
And as Zach's talking about reflecting the quality of the instruction, reflecting the content, and just getting at the qualities in general, oftentimes we find when we're reviewing sample submissions of UbD templates, we find adjectives, sometimes we find nouns, if it helps to sort of have a part of speech in mind that you can take off from. And we'll get to that a little bit more in depth when we look at putting it all together with the completed sample related to the driver's ed piece.
So when you're in this portion of unit development, again, as I mentioned before, you know what the end goal is. This is the portion where you really need to think like an assessor, or think like somebody who objectively is going to sit back and look at student work or look at a performance, and at the end be able to say, after looking again at those established goals that you set in stage 1, yes, this student has demonstrated the knowledge of those learning objectives or the skills that they need to possess in order to demonstrate true proficiency.
So let's look at some of the guiding questions that as you answer these questions, they'll help you to flesh out both your understanding as well as this section of the template. So first we ask, how will students be asked to demonstrate their knowledge and skill acquisition related to the established goals? And it's important here again that we call out the close relationship between stage 1, the goals that you've set out, and the quality or evaluation criteria that you're going to use to assess students' performance and growth.
So if you're creating a unit where you're asking for students to demonstrate ability in a content area, let's say with historical perspective, let's say you're a social studies or a history teacher, when you're developing this stage of your template, your evaluation criteria should include something that is related to historical perspective or knowledge of history. So here's where you're really starting to be more specific related to the content or grade level in which you teach.
We follow that by asking, what will we accept as evidence of student understanding? And it's really important that we stop and we really think deliberately and meaningfully about what are we going to accept that's going to illustrate for us that students have had that aha, I've got it moment.
And in Falmouth Public Schools, I think we really pride ourselves in the rigorous curriculum, easy for me to say, that we engage all of our students in. And certainly when we're looking at this portion of the template, we want to be thinking about higher order thinking skills. We want to be thinking about Bloom's taxonomy. And for those of you who have done more work in understanding by design, you know that Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe, the authors of UbD, really believe in this, what they call the 6 facets of understanding. Certainly, we have more resources on that. But if you are familiar with those 6 facets, this is where you'd want to include them within your template.
And then finally, we have to ask, how will we evaluate student performance in relation to the learning goals? And when we set out to have this conversation about evaluation criteria within the screencast, we reminded you to think about rubric development. And so really, that's what we're getting at here, because those evaluation criteria that you identify and you list within your unit template, they're being carried over to your rubric. And then you have to further qualify what they look like at different levels of development, accomplishment, or growth as the students complete the performance of the task by which you've set out your assessment. One other thing that I'd like to call out here for some of my colleagues at the secondary level, in particular at the high school level, is that when we first started our curriculum development work with the 5-column curriculum guide, and my colleagues know what that means, we had a place in which we would articulate the FHS skills, whether we were drawing from the academic, social, or civic expectations. And we would put which skills we were working on, or which sort of subsets or different components of those skills we were looking at in that part of the unit plan. This is the place in which you can plug that information when you're developing your unit, because those are pieces that will later be carried over to your unit assessment rubric, or perhaps to even some of the more lesson-specific assessments that you might be using, depending on the caliber of those assessments and whether or not they require a formal rubric, or perhaps you have a more formative sort of benchmarking rubric that you're using along the way. But this is one of those things I wanted to pull out because, as Zach mentioned earlier, there's a combination of layers here. There's the federal or sort of government level, there's the state standards and what they require, and then there's also embedded within that local initiatives tied both to the strategic plan and other forces or initiatives in which we're engaged, and one of which is accreditation, which is where those pieces come from.
So next we want to look at some pitfalls and problems that unit developers and teachers come across when they're in this unit development process. And one problem that comes across is that the evaluation criteria or rubrics are invalid. And what does that mean? It means that the assessments that teachers are giving students may inadvertently not correlate to the unit goals or the established goals that were articulated during stage 1. When that happens, student success can't be accurately measured because the assessment that we're asking students to complete or participate in isn't truly reflected in the learning goals. And what happens is sometimes educators get so wrapped up in the process of the assessment that they're getting away from measuring the student's proficiency. Sometimes we see that when we tie grades to neatness and organization versus that end goal of understanding and synthesis.
And so there are 2 levels of revision that we might call out at that point. One might be a stage 2 revision, a revision of the assessment and what we're looking at by the evaluative criteria and perhaps the assessment evidences we're going to get to in a second. And in some cases, that revision actually might be a loop back to stage 1 and revisiting the goals. Have we really articulated the goals that we are looking at and really seeking to have students achieve within the unit? And if the answer is no, we need to reevaluate those goals before we move on with adjusting the assessment. So as we close the part on evaluation criteria, right, the points by which we're going to measure, we need to look at the assessments themselves and the assessment evidence. So we move to the next stage of the stage 2 piece of the framework.
So when we looked at the evaluation criteria, we looked at what are the characteristics of the assessment that are going to prove student proficiency. This portion of the unit development is actually the design of the assessment. We're going to talk about 2 different assessment types, one being a performance task, and then one other category where we're going to lump a large number of traditional assessments, and we're just going to call that other evidence. For those of you at the elementary level, we've been doing some work this year with the model curriculum units that were developed by the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and a part of all of those units is what we've been calling the CEPAs, the Curriculum Embedded Performance Assessment. That CEPA would fall within these performance tasks. And it's important to think about what we mean by a performance task. Performance tasks typically reflect real world challenges that face adults, things that you might encounter day to day. They include some short term and long term projects, and then they usually yield one or more tangible products or presentations and performances. So it's a little different than maybe some of the typical tests that you're used to seeing.
And when you think about developing a performance, think about the fact that a performance must be something that can only be done well by those students who get it, who get the concepts and have forged the understandings that you're leading them towards in your teaching and learning within the unit. And I think just to help get at some of the pieces that Zach just pointed out, there's sort of three different pieces we can scaffold into this to help you ensure authenticity in the development of your performance. The first is having that goal in mind. Again, a link back to stage one, but really thinking clearly about the goal of the performance. What is it that is going to happen? Determine that target audience. For whom is this performance going to be oriented towards? And then set realistic constraints. If within the performance you have budget restrictions that you set up for students, if you have a particular time limit, any constraint you can put on it that makes it more authentic, more like a real world scenario in which they might find themselves. And again, as Zach mentioned, the more tangible the product, the more authentic, hopefully, the assessment can be.
And you'll also notice that the performance task that you develop really should cover many of the unit objectives. It really wouldn't be beneficial to have a performance task that's only related to one of the goals that you had established during stage one. The performance task is the culmination of the entire unit. That entire unit of study that you've developed should have one or two tasks that students can complete that would demonstrate their ability to tie all of those learning objectives together, synthesize, and then show that work in a different way, which can help an outside observer demonstrate or articulate that student's proficiency related to those goals.
And likewise, we'd be remiss if we didn't take a moment and talk about the other evidence box. So within that, as Zach mentioned at the outset here, these are the other maybe more seemingly traditional things that we do that aren't necessarily performances. This could include ORQs or EBRs. This could include quizzes, longer, structured writing responses. However, it's not enough to list here, 2 EBRs, 1 quiz, or a series of reading quizzes. You also need to include at some level a summary of the evidence that you're going to gather from the assessment. What are you going to recognize as achievement of one of your goals from stage one based on that? So if you have an EBR that shows students' ability to select appropriate textual evidence and then analyze that in response to the prompt, then you've really completed the entry, or one bullet point, if you will, under other evidence as opposed to just writing EBR. So that needs to be fleshed out as well.
And certainly as educators, we understand that there is a need for testing related to more types of multiple choice and true and false, and activities where students need to demonstrate the memorization of different things such as multiplication and division tables and states and capitals. So certainly we don't want to make it sound like there's no place for any of those types of assessments. However, when we're talking about the culminating activity of something that you've probably spent 4, 6, or 8 weeks on, we're looking for a higher level of rigor that students need to engage in to demonstrate proficiency. Of course, those other pieces of evidence that you're collecting along the way are building on the student's ability to complete the performance task. However, when we look at the end of a unit of study, it's just not enough to look at some of those lower level skills.
And some of those other pieces may also be used formatively along the way to help you benchmark students' understanding and determine where they might need a little reinforcement and where they might be able to move a little bit faster than you may have anticipated. So let's look at some of the key questions that we can answer to help ourselves flesh out these two parts of the framework.
First, we're looking to see if the assessment allows students to demonstrate and or transfer their understandings of the established goals. And that's really important. They're demonstrating their understanding of the goals. There's that connection back to stage one. If your assessment is providing opportunities for students to demonstrate understanding of things other than those established goals, this might be a time to go back and do what Sonia talked about, that revision process. Either you're revising the evidence section, or you're going back to stage one and maybe you're adding one or two more goals that you now feel are important in the success of this overall unit.
The next question we have to ask is, do the assessments require students to engage in higher order thinking to demonstrate their mastery of knowledge and skills, to show what they know and what they are able to do? And this gets at the knowledge that we talked about from stage one, and what they're able to do, what they're skilled at, the skills that come from stage one. Again, direct, deliberate connections between stage one and stage two to map out and get ourselves prepared for the learning plan.
And finally, do the students have opportunities to demonstrate their ability to transfer the knowledge and skills attained into unique contexts? So in other words, are you almost giving them a performance task that they're not prepared for, other than the content that's involved in it? So is it a project that really they haven't gone through before? Is it unique? Is it authentic? That's something that you want to keep in mind as you're developing this unit. And a lot of those curriculum embedded performance assessments are just that. It's a task that students haven't been simulating along the way in preparation for this end of unit project. It's something authentic, it's something that they haven't done before, and it's truly showing their ability to transfer their knowledge in a variety of ways.
So let's then look at some of the pitfalls that we may encounter in preparing our assessment evidence. The first is looking at, and again, we're taking this from our reading of Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins, Solving 25 Problems in Unit Design, and we've got more specific information for you on the resource page. But a performance task may be considered authentic if it reflects the way in which the people in the world outside of school, outside of the classroom, are asked to use knowledge and skill to address various situations where their expertise is tested or challenged. And I think sometimes, we might come at this when we talk about, maybe something around engineering, something around design. We're asking students to solve a problem. But this is much broader, and this can be applied in a number of different arenas, and it's not sort of limited to one or two disciplines.
Certainly, talking about something different than pen and paper tests, but having students engage in a debate where they're having points and counterpoints. Certainly, we're not assessing the stance that a student takes, whether they're quote-unquote right or wrong in the debate, but you're looking at the evidence that they're bringing to the table. Are they able to maybe sway the opinions of other people in the room? Those are the types of things we're looking at for performance tasks, and we're looking for those real-world, authentic opportunities for students.
And in this case, if you engage in a debate, as Zach mentioned, maybe the transfer isn't taking necessarily just the skills of debate from one subject to another, but if they're articulating evidence to support their ideas in the conversation, seeing and tracking and seeing how they transfer that into their writing is another way of looking at transfer. Not just subject to subject, but also the nature of one task to the nature of another where it calls upon the same skill set.
And certainly building upon that, we want to talk about knowing our students and providing them with opportunities to be successful. So your performance tasks may look different depending on the student. Some students may perform in an oral debate with another student or two students in the class, when another student can demonstrate the same level of proficiency by writing a persuasive piece.
And then here we have a second pitfall. Just to close out this part of our conversation, the proposed assessments do not provide appropriate evidence for all unit goals. Assessment provides a valid measure when performance on the specific assessment lets us draw sound inferences about achievement of a much broader goal. So we're talking about identifying learning outcomes from stage one specific to the assessments that we're talking about developing here in stage two. Now, one of the things that we talked about is having an opportunity to share with your colleague. If you share your assessment plan with your colleague and ask your colleague to identify what he or she thinks are your learning goals, you can look to see if you're on the right track or if there's a mismatch. And then again, you'd have to engage in the revision process at either stage one or two.
It's really important that you see a direct correlation between the assessment that you're providing in this evidence piece of stage two and those established goals back in stage 1. And furthermore, they should tie to those essential questions that we talked about. What are the deep understandings that you want students to have as a result of this unit of study?
So we've shared a lot, and we've shared many of our ideas and tried to help flesh out some of yours and develop your understandings, if you will, in relation to stage 1. Let's look at putting it all together. Let's return to that universal idea around driver's ed. And again, we've adapted and worked with this and taken it from the Understanding by Design Guide to Creating High Quality Units. Again, the resource provided here in a second. But you can see the evaluation criteria laid out. And the evaluation criteria laid out both by their relationship to the performance tasks, and then just below that, the evaluation criteria are laid out against the other assessment evidence. The performance tasks and the, quote, other evidence are still interconnected and related.
So looking back at that evaluation criteria specific to the performance tasks, what are the students going to need to demonstrate, or what is their work going to show to prove that they're proficient related to those goals in stage 1? The author of this unit is saying that students will need to demonstrate that they're skillful and courteous, and that they're defensive, and that they anticipate well, and that they respond to varied road conditions. What's on the right is what the exercise that the students will participate in that will then be able to prove that evaluation criteria.
And so, you have this sort of global picture, but the one thing that Zach and I can't stress enough is that the underpinning to all of this is the idea, and we've mentioned it, I think, several times over, of transfer. The long-term goal of learning is transfer, not cued response to test questions. It's not about the volume that a student can memorize. It's about what they do with the information and the understandings they derive from their experience.
You'll see that we talk a little more about this when we go into stage 3, which is our next screencast, where we'll be talking about the instructional planning, that now that we understand what our students are going to need to know, and now that we've developed the tool by which we will be assessing their knowledge, the next part is that stage 3, which is the actual learning plan, those day-to-day activities that you will engage your students in to get them to where they need to be.
So just as we conclude this part of the conversation, here's a look at our resources. We hope that, if you need them, you'll reach out to us in the Office of Curriculum Instruction. Many are available for you to borrow. And we'll be chatting with you again soon as we re-engage in the conversation for stage 3.
I didn't realize that.
Your battery's dead?
Yeah. I want to save this quickly. Stage 2.